My name is Steve Kemple. I'm the music librarian down here in the Popular Library. And I'm just going to give a brief, awkward introduction that entails me describing what I'm doing. This is History of Cincinnati Music Part 5, an ongoing series. Really excited about this one, so I'm going to turn it over to Uncle Dave Lewis, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what we're going to talk about.
Okay. Were there acknowledgments you needed to make? Okay, I thought you did. I first ran across mention of James L. Landon and Ohio Phonograph about 15 years ago, and the first thing I did was to ask Patrick Feaster about it, to look into it, and he did, in a big way. We pulled our resources and presented on this topic at the Association of Recorded Sound Collections conference in Cleveland in 2004. It has long been a dream of mine to be able to represent this paper here in Cincinnati, and thanks to Steve Kemple and the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, my dream comes true this evening. However, looking into the knotty questions that I tend to dredge up is far from being the only thing that Patrick does, and I have asked him to start off the evening in demonstrating some of the works he does with the First Sounds Group, and in advancing the knowledge we have to gain in terms of the early phonograph industry. He is a professor in communication and culture, is it, department at Indiana University in Bloomington, and a nominee for a Grammy Award of late, and the recent compiler of the first ever CD collection of Cal Stewart, known to phonograph enthusiasts as Uncle Josh. Please welcome Patrick Feaster.
Thanks for having me. We will be talking about the earliest history of recorded sound in Ohio. We'll be playing a lot of it. You'll be listening to many very, very early recordings, many of them made right here in Cincinnati. But as Uncle Dave said, he's asked me to start off by talking a little bit about early recorded sound in general, particularly work I've been involved with hunting down and playing back some of the very earliest recorded sounds there are. And so the place I'd like to begin talking about that is with this group you see here. This is myself on the right, David Giovannoni in the middle, and then Richard Martin, Megan Hennessy of Archaeophone Records on the left. The four of us had, in 2007, just finished pulling together this CD, Actionable Offenses, Indecent Phonograph Recordings from the 1890s, a collection of...
There are a couple of them over here, but a couple of the library copies.
And this was, I believe, probably the earliest set of recordings that ever had to be bleeped on NPR. But we had a very positive time working together in this project, and we started talking together about what we might do next to kind of continue the momentum that we've been building up. And so one idea that was put forward was, well, let's see if we can hunt down the very earliest recorded sounds of any kind that are out there at all, and try to get them to talk and sing. And so we founded what is now known as the First Sounds Initiative at firstsounds.org. You can check out some of the work that we've been up to. But the group, basically, a rather loosely organized group, but with the goal of finding, playing back, and making available to all people for all time the very earliest recorded sounds there are. And what are the very earliest recorded sounds? Well, we knew, and many other people had known for some time, that the very earliest sound recordings, in the sense of someone capturing sound waves out of the air over time, that the very earliest recordings had been made on the device called the Phonograph, which was the invention of a French typesetter and proofreader named Edouard Léon Spot de Martinville. Basically, his idea was this: he'd been proofreading scientific works about how the human ear works. And so he wanted to build an artificial ear, where essentially you'd have a funnel that would be like the outer part of the ear, and then a membrane at the end of it, like the eardrum, so that it would catch sounds coming through the air. But then instead of passing the signals along to our brain so that we could hear them, he just attached a little stylus to the other side of the membrane and let it trail against a piece of soot-covered paper wrapped around the cylinder. So he'd turn this cylinder, shout into the funnel, the stylus would start waving around, it would trace a wavy line on paper. Not to play it back. Playing these things back was not part of his plan at all. He just wanted to make a record of sound so that he could look at it and try to understand what it was, and perhaps to learn more about sounds, to lead to understanding it better. So and they ended up looking like this. You see the book there on the right. A lot of these were published at the time. And in theory, this is the same thing as modern sound recordings of various types. That wavy line means the same thing as the waveform displayed in the software down there at the bottom left, where that's a very highly blown up picture of a vinyl LP groove there at the top. These wavy lines basically mean the same thing, just back and forth motion over time. So people had understood for a long time you could play back these recordings if you wanted to, even though that wasn't why they'd been made. The problems, well, there were really two of them. One, nobody really had a convenient way of doing this until relatively recently, with digital approaches to sound that have made it a lot more convenient to do this kind of work. You could have done it many years ago, just it would have been a lot of work. But secondly, nobody really knew about any good long phonographs. They looked mostly like the picture you see in the book there, these very, very short things. So yes, maybe you could play them back, but they'd last for a split second. Not very exciting. But back in 2007, 2008, my colleagues in the First Sounds Initiative and I found a number of much longer phonographs in a few archives in France. By March of 2008, within just a few weeks of learning about these things, we managed to play them back as sound. And that led to our press release in March 2008. The world's oldest sound recordings played for the first time, unveiled at the conference of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections in Palo Alto. And it made a fairly decent splash in the news. It was interesting, though, to see how different national news services dealt with story. In the United States, this was a front page story. Researchers play tune recorded before Edison. In France, it was 20 years before Edison, a Frenchman invented sound recording. In Germany, it was sounds like a strangled chicken. And it made radio as well.
American historians have discovered what they think is the earliest recording of the human voice, made on a device which scratched sound waves onto paper blackened by smoke. It was made in 1860, 17 years before Thomas Edison first demonstrated the gramophone, and featured an excerpt from a French song, Au clair de la lune. The award-winning screenwriter Abby Mann has died at the age of 80. He won an Academy Award in 1961 for Judgment at Nuremberg. Abby Mann also won several Emmys, including one in 1973 for a film which featured a police detective called the character on whom a long-running TV series was eventually based.
It's 10 minutes past 8. Fighting between sheer militia.
In the business, that's known as corpsing, and this is considered one of the top 10 cases of that ever on the BBC. And it's nice to see that something that we pulled out of the murky recorded past was able to have such a powerful effect on someone in the 21st century. She's not alone. We see the grassroots response to this stuff out there. And other people were impressed with it as a technological feat, both then and now. That is technological accomplishment for Scott to have made the recording and us to have played it back.
It was basically an audio recording. It wasn't basically, it was an audio recording. An audio. No, it's an audio recording. And it had never been played back because the technology did not exist at the time. It wouldn't exist to properly play it back till about 30 years later with Thomas Edison. But this guy in France, he actually was able to record the human voice in a form that could be played back. It just took about another century to get played back, a century and a half, really, to be played back. And what happened is these researchers, they took the recording that he had made, and they were able to put it into the computer and digitized it.
I can't really put it better than that myself. That's a pretty good explanation. Another response we got a lot was this one.
Now listen to the audio. This is so spooky. It's the song Au clair de la lune. They just got the second verse of it, but you gotta listen to this. It is so spooky.
So spooky. It's giving people goosebumps to hear a voice from so very, very long ago. But here we had the voice of what sounded like a young girl, and we had brought her voice back. We thought maybe this was the inventor's daughter or something like that, from this event where this young person singing. Before the outbreak of the American Civil War, we can listen to her again today. Or could we? Had we actually done what we thought we had? Well, Scott let us know the correct speed for playing these phonograms by recording a time reference. It was a tuning fork that he wrote, vibrated 500 simple vibrations a second tuning fork. So we thought, oh, 500 hertz. That's what we used to set our playback speed that went all around the world in all of these news reports. And then I went to play another phonogram set to the same speed. This time it was speech instead of singing. This is what I heard, played at the same speed. Look. Here it is at half that speed. So, turned out it was actually 250 hertz tuning fork. So we thought we'd recaptured the voice of a young girl singing before the American Civil War. In fact, we came up with the 19th century version of the Chipmunks. But it's a continuous learning process working with this material. It's only got some more press out of it, and maybe we don't have the voice of Scott's young daughter singing into his device for an experiment in 1860, but instead we have the inventor himself singing the song perhaps as he would have sung his daughter to sleep as a lullaby. Now that's a pretty monumental thing you just heard there. This is the oldest, really recognizable recording of the human voice there is. Recognizable in the sense of the melody. But it's also not that lively a recording. So I just want to be sure that you go away knowing that he also recorded some livelier stuff. This is another phonograph he recorded in 1860, The Song of the Bee from the comic opera Queen Topaz by Victor Mastet. Now, the first person to record a sound and play it back was Thomas Edison. And he used a very similar process to what we were just talking about in terms of making a recording. He's indenting a sheet of tin foil into a groove. The problem with this approach was that you take a piece of tin foil off, you can't very well wrap it back on again. Wears out very quickly if you try to play it a bunch of times. So it actually took longer, it was more difficult to get sound out of a tin foil that was supposed to be played back than it has been to get sound out of phonograms that weren't supposed to be played back. But in 2012, finally we got a good playback of a tin foil recording for the first time. You'll hear someone playing music on a cornet, and then some nursery rhymes, Mary Had a Little Lamb and Old Mother Hubbard. Recorded sounds, usually in halls and public exhibitions of various sorts. That's the kind of thing that was being recorded and played back really on the spot. That's what you would have heard at an event of that sort. Now, I can't take credit for playing this one back. This is the work of the team of Carl Haber at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who has the optical method of reading 3D, basically using 3D scanning to play back some of these very fragile early recordings. His team also did the next couple of examples that I'd like to share with you. But in these other cases, this is the work of the Volta Laboratory associated with Alexander Graham Bell. Edison put the phonograph on the back burner for a while to focus on electric lighting. Alexander Graham Bell and his team picked things up, did a lot of experiments, a lot of them preserved today at the Smithsonian. I studied them there a couple years ago, made a list of them, identified a number of them. This is one of the items that I looked at. This is probably the most famous sound recording from the 1880s or the early 1880s. It's a recording that was made on a tinfoil phonograph, except they filled in the groove with wax and then cut a recording in the wax. The idea being they were going to try to play it back with a jet of air, aiming a jet of air at the groove, bouncing air off it. They thought that would enable them to play it back. And here's the content of it from their notebook. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in our philosophy. I am a graphophone, and my mother was a phonograph. Recorded around 25th September 1881. But I'm a graphophone and my mother was a phonograph is an interesting one. There are various explanations for that. But the correct one, I think, is actually this, that phonograph to Alexander Graham Bell meant something you used to record sound. But a machine to play back sound, you needed a different name for that. So he called that a graphophone. So this recording is speaking to you. It's saying, I, this machine playing back sound, I am a graphophone. My mother, the thing used to make this recording, was a phonograph. That's probably what was meant here. Various other methods they used to try to record sound. Some were photographic. Here's one setup where the mouthpiece, the diaphragm was covering up a slit like this. You'd expose it to light, run a surface across it, so that depending on how long or how long it was held open, you'd have a darker or a lighter spot on the disc. Okay, so that was the idea. They would record sound like this and then play it back by shining a light through the disc onto a selenium cell, which would then play back your sound. So what does this sort of thing sound like? Well, here's one example that was played back recently. There's some controversy, though, about the words to this recording, so I'd like you to pay attention particularly to the point that the Smithsonian officially transcribes as, "Oh no." How is this for high was basically 19th century slang for how do you like them apples? But this bit that says, or according to the Smithsonian, was oh no. What does it sound like to you? Now, look at the point where it actually happened in the recording. There's this big black splotch right afterwards. So something had gone terribly wrong with the experiment. And then someone says, now, could be oh no, but really the majority of people, the unanimous consensus, I think, of people who studied this recording is not oh no. So I can see why the Smithsonian wouldn't have wanted to let that little detail out when they did the press releases about that. You know, the headlines would have been not, experimental recordings of Alexander Graham Bell, but world's oldest recorded F-bomb recovered from artifact at the Smithsonian, or something like this blog post here. But I think it wonderfully humanizes the whole business of 19th century experiments in sound recording to have had someone have an experiment go wrong, and what do? Instinctively? They swear. So the Volta Laboratory group ended up with a prototype like the thing you see at the top there, by 1886 or so, they had this machine that they expected to be used for dictation purposes. And it had a wax cylinder into which a recording would be cut rather than just embossed as with tinfoil. They approached Edison with this, said, hey, let's work together on this. Edison said, no way! You're stealing my idea! Get out of here! So both groups ended up developing separate machines. The Volta people with Alexander Graham Bell developed this machine called the graphophone that you see here on the left. Well, Edison developed the thing there on the right called the improved phonograph. And for a while it looked as though there was going to be a huge battle royal between these two technologies. Either a battle in the marketplace or, more likely, some kind of patent litigation. Ended up being forestalled by a guy named Jesse Lippincott, who brought both machines together under himself, under this arrangement called the North American Phonograph Company, that would market both of them, let customers decide which they liked better between the two machines. The thing is, there was a third machine just on the horizon at this point. The gramophone that was invented in 1887 by Emil Berliner. This is really the ancestor of modern turntables and vinyl and things like that. If you trace those right back to the point of origin, it's not Edison's phonograph, it's really this device, the gramophone. But the earliest examples of this sort of thing we can listen to today aren't discs like the one that you see here. They're actually pictures in magazines and other paper prints of these wavy lines that made up sound recordings. Remember, there really isn't anything more to a sound recording than a wavy line. If you zoom in really close on a vinyl LP, that's what you'll see is a wavy line and a long spiral. So I've played back a few examples of these, and this is how I do it. I scan it at high resolution, invert it white to black, do a transformation to move it from a spiral into straight lines, and then I basically use a similar technique to what I use with phonograms. This is how it's done. I'd be happy to answer any questions about that later. But the important thing to understand now is we get sound out of these pictures. Here's an example that I played back a year or two ago. This is the oldest audio from a gramophone recording that we can listen to today. So in this format that we now are familiar with as vintage vinyl and so forth. This is the inventor himself reciting a poem in German. So Emil Berliner reciting a German poem. Okay, the disadvantage here is, unless you know German, then you need a translation to follow along. So here's another example. This is one I played back from the Library of Congress. This one I think you can get something out of without a translation.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That's all my opinion. More than war, was the smoke and free and cold. Now Jesse from Bacon Blossom, and Mrs. Manuel Ben Yasson, who's your man, that's on the rock.
As far as I'm aware, that was the song is Weites Morgen gesang. That's the oldest known recording of singing in the German language today. Play back from a picture. So, various kinds of audio we can recover from the very distant past, but this format, the gramophone, didn't really become a commercial contender until the middle of the 1890s. We're still back in the 1880s at this point. So what happens? Well, Edison's phonograph really wins out over the graphophone in the marketplace pretty quickly. And in particular, one reason for this, Edison developed the entertainment side of the phonograph. People often will say that Edison didn't want the phonograph being used as a source of entertainment. But, in fact, the truth is a bit different. He actually hired this guy here full-time, starting in February of 1888, to work on nothing but developing the musical side of his new phonograph. And he did a pretty good job of this. He developed techniques and so forth. The very first full-time professional recording studio anywhere in the world was on the 3rd floor of Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. This is what it looked like back then. It looks a little different now, but you can go visit it if you ever go see Thomas Edison National Historical Park in West Orange. It's available now to tour. And so it wasn't really a problem to make pretty decent records at this point. The difficulty was in making copies of them. I mean, how are you going to make lots and lots of copies of a cylindrical sound recording? You could try to use a bowl, but if you have an ordinary bowl that opens up and closes, it would have a seam along one side. So you're playing it, it's going around about 120 times a minute. Every time it hits that seam, it would make a noise. This wouldn't work very well. Actually, it turned out to be very difficult to come up with a way of making molded copies of cylinders. They did finally figure it out, but at this point they hadn't yet. So the only way to make a recording, as of this time, this is about 1889, the only way to make a recording was to make an original recording on a phonograph cylinder. And the only way to make a lot of phonograph cylinders from a single performance was to group a bunch of phonographs around a performer and record the same performance in all of them at once, which was not a very good way to make millions of dollars. It was very, very time consuming. And as of, say, early 1890, there was a lot of demand for phonograph cylinders. People wanted them for demonstration purposes. The whole country had been divided up among all of these little sub-companies. Each company owned the rights to the phonograph in some area. Only they could lease phonographs. Only they could sell phonograph supplies. And they all wanted demonstration material. They all wanted musical records from Edison, who was having a really tough time making enough of them. January of 1890, he said, "This is too much trouble. It's more trouble than it's worth. I'm getting out of the business. You local companies, why don't you see what kind of records you might like to make?" And one of the companies that really jumped at this was the one operated right here, the Ohio Phonograph Company. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Uncle.
Let's have a hand for Patrick, please. I just need a little help getting my PowerPoint started. That was excellent. Thank you. And in fact, if you just want to minimize, well, okay, I guess it went away now. But yeah. And how do you advance the frame on this computer? No, okay, thanks. Some of you have expressed disbelief in the very topic that we are presenting tonight. How is it that Cincinnati should have been one of the first stops along the commercial recording trail when we didn't have a studio here before King Records in 1944? The simple answer is that our local role has been forgotten, along with the whole of the recording industry of the 1890s. And it's an inconvenient truth that was not covered well by the first historians of recorded sound. And even a basic understanding of it has developed only lately. And Mr. Feaster has had a lot to do with those developments. Although he's not the only one, but he's a prominent guy. One little known fact about Thomas Edison is that he lived in Cincinnati in the 1860s. And he worked as a telegraph operator during the Civil War. And that's one of the reasons when he died in 1931, the local newspapers carried stories about Edison that ran for page after page, huge obituaries, because he was regarded as a significant local person. Let's see, I meant to advance my picture. There he is as a young man. Okay, we partly owe Edison's achievements in the field of recorded sound to his bitter rivalry with fellow inventor Alexander Graham Bell. Edison was incensed that Bell discovered the telephone before he did. His first invention, the universal stock ticker of 1869, was based on telegraph technology, just like the telephone. So Edison began to tinker with the telephone just to see if there was any way that he could get one up on Bell. And within a year, he produced the tinfoil phonograph, which oddly enough was a machine that didn't use any electricity, but it was the result of his experiments. Edison toured the phonograph for 2 years, and it was first exhibited here on May the 31st, 1878, by Ezra Gilliland, who was an inventor who worked very closely with Edison. And within a couple of days, the paper's letters to the editor were already showing up in the local newspapers asking that question, well, Mr. Edison, when are we going to have this phonograph in our homes? And Edison didn't have a response for that for more than 10 years. The tinfoil phonograph was like a computer that had only 1 kilobyte of memory, and it forgot that every 5th time that you booted it up. Patrick has already recounted some of the problems besetting the tinfoil phonograph, such as its awful sound, and as a consequence, Edison was unable to find backing for further develop that device, although he continued to refer to it as my favorite invention. His next discovery, the incandescent light bulb, and oh, there he was. Well, you saw this picture before anyway. It was a far better idea in that there was an immediate demand for it to light factories, cities, and ultimately private homes. Edison's light bulb was easy to produce, practically promoted itself, was easy to protect from infringers and all kinds of advantageous things as an invention. The phonograph was almost the opposite of that. Nevertheless, as soon as Mr. Edison set the phonograph aside, Mr. Bell's laboratory began to pick it up and quietly make improvements on it. This is the light system that Patrick was alluding to before. That was one of the experimental machines that they used. It doesn't look like something that would record sound, but it did. In the end, Volta's major discovery was a wax cylinder, which, although it would show signs of wear over time, could be played more than 100 times and still hold the information that was recorded onto it. By virtue of changing the composition of the software, Volta discovered that they were able to fix the problem of the tinfoil phonograph's too short memory. When Edison found out about it, he was mad as hell. This famous photograph, taken in 1888, allegedly shows Edison after several sleepless days spent working to improve his favorite invention. It is a publicity photo actually taken a few months after the fact. In truth, some months before, Edison had already conducted this research and had these sleepless nights, and the main conclusion that he reached was, wow, these wax cylinders really do work better than tinfoil. Volta was not going to wait for Edison's cooperation in promoting their patent, which they were awarded in 1886. Shortly after, they began to look for people who might be able to help them to get into production. And it was during this search that they found James Lambert Andom, a figure who is central to the story of the Ohio Phonograph Company. Born in Massachusetts in 1842, Andom grew up in New York City, traveled to Europe as a teenager, and returned to serve in the Union Army, making it to the rank of the first lieutenant. At war's end, he became a stenographer, and in 1868, he married a lady named Grace Russell Lombard, whose brother was Thomas Lombard, a mining engineer. Grace's older sister, Emily, was married to a shipping merchant named Henry Leeds, and their sons included Harry, William, Loring, and Edward Leeds, all of whom played a role in the early phonograph industry. Resettling in Washington, D.C., Andom rose to prominence in a capital environment absorbed in major cases and complex post-war legislation, post-Civil War. The workload was so heavy for stenographers that a warm welcome was accorded the Volta graphophone when it arrived in the spring of 1887, courtesy of James O. Clephane and Andrew Devine, not to be confused with Andy Devine, court reporters who had been cultivated by Volta to promote the new device, and founders of the American Graphophone Company. One of the first in line to order one of the machines was a fellow named Edward Easton, a court reporter who would go on to found what became called the Columbia Phonograph Company. That represented the District of Columbia. Another was James Andom, who subsequently wrote this testimonial. I have made use of the phonograph graphophone in connection with my professional work as a stenographer, more especially in making transcripts from my shorthand notes of the proceedings of committees in the United States Senate during the present session of Congress. The practical advantages found in the use of the phonograph graphophone are, first, rapidity of dictation. Instead of being compelled to regulate the speed of dictation to the capacity of a typewriter operator, the reporter can dictate to the phonograph graphophone at any rate of speed he chooses, probably 3 times as fast to the most expert typewriter operator. Still, another advantage is the ability it gives to add to the number of assistants who can be employed in making transcripts. The phonograph graphophone cylinders can be distributed among as many typewriter operators as may be found necessary, and the reporter is not limited to the amount of work that one operator can receive from dictation. In other words, he is able to take a full day's proceedings and make transcripts rapidly, where formerly he was compelled to obtain the assistance of another stenographer to take a portion of the notes and dictate them to his own typewriter operator. The phonograph graphophone will eventually become a necessity to every stenographer who is desirous of getting out his work rapidly, and will increase his capacity of transcribing his notes very greatly. About this time, Andom's brother-in-law, Thomas Lombard, returned from Honduras with $500,000 which he wanted to invest in a new enterprise. Oh yeah, we're not at the, I lost the picture, duh. Well, we'll go back to this one. Andom promptly introduced Thomas Lombard to the graphophone, and Lombard pulled together a syndicate of investors to obtain exclusive rights to the device. That didn't work out. But one of the investors, whom Patrick mentioned, Jesse Lippincott, worked out an alternative plan, and the contracts were signed in March 1888. Lippincott also reached out to Thomas Edison and somehow managed to get him on board. The resulting patents pool was incorporated as the North American Phonograph Company. Under Lippincott's plan, the nation was divided up into territories, as in the map you saw earlier, and then those territories were parceled out to interested investors. Andom got the territory of Ohio. Not all of the territories were snapped at once, and as Patrick's map showed us, some were never claimed. But Andom hit the ground running and was in Ohio laying the groundwork for Ohio Phonograph by late in the year 1888. He did not wait. There was some question as to whether the corporate office of Ohio Phonograph would be established in Cleveland or Cincinnati. But in the end, they decided on Cincinnati, and it opened around December 15th, 1888. By January, the Cincinnati Gazette reports that the office of Ohio Phonograph here in Cincinnati was fully furnished and already had a full staff of stenographers who were just buzzing it away transcribing cylinders. And we will hear how things went for Andom. in his own words as we move on through this. But I wanted to go ahead and establish some of the locations in Cincinnati where Ohio Phonograph Company sites were held. And this information came from local city directories. Inconveniently for me, the numbering on the street grid was changed twice in the 1890s. Once in 1892, and I guess they didn't get it right the first time because they changed it again in 1895. Using old maps of Cincinnati at the Cincinnati Historical Society, I was able to find all of 5 locations in Cincinnati where Ohio Phonograph held offices. And number 1, it's the building on the right, and it's still standing. This is the corporate headquarters of Ohio Phonograph Company in 1889. It's 123 West 4th Street, East 4th Street. In 1888, it was 27 West 4th Street, and you can see why I get confused. Today, you know, the east-west corridor is Vine Street, but before that, it was Main Street, and that makes sense because it's Main Street, right? But they moved it, okay? And that's just the beginning of that particular nightmare. But anyway, this is the building. I'd love to go in the basement. I've never been down there just to see if I find any cylinders. But it still stands. Unfortunately, this is as close as we can get to the 2nd Street location of Ohio Phonograph. It was on 2nd Street, which was completely wiped out, except for a tiny bit, which I think is what they renamed Pete Rose Way, the last little bit of 2nd Street. But it was wiped out in 1960 by the Fort Washington Way development. This office, it wasn't an arcade, and I don't really know what it was, but I suspect it was used to fabricate cabinets and do other work with machines. I mean, it was near the river, and there was a rail line that ran through that part of the waterfront, so it would have been a good place to receive things from the Edison Company. This you'll recognize is the Ray Street entrance of the arcade that runs through the Netherland Hilton, which is to me the Carew Tower. In 1890, this was still an arcade, but the building around it has changed. Carew Tower was erected in 1929. Closer to the Vine Street side in 1890, there was an Ohio Phonograph Company arcade, the first one, which opened in what would have been the Emory Arcade. And a couple years later, they moved up closer to the Ray Street side within the same arcade. This is the Ray Street entrance. In his court transcripts, Mr. Andom refers to my Ray Street location. And he didn't actually have a location on Ray Street, but what he probably meant was the one inside the arcade that was near Ray Street. This might be one or the other of those. This is the view of the inside of an Ohio Phonograph arcade in the 1890s. We don't know exactly which one, but one thing that we can say, I can say, this machine here, that's an odd duck. That's a kinetophonograph, which is a machine that was sort of like a primitive talking picture device. And it wasn't available before 1895. So that helps to date this photo. And that might even be Mr. Andom sitting right there, although I can't tell. But that might be the Ray Street store. He had a location on Main Street, you know. I think it might have been about here. This block is entirely different from the way it was laid out in the 1890s because it was dominated by one of the most impressive buildings in the history of Cincinnati. This was the combined U.S. Post Office and government building that used to be located where Government Square is now. Believe it or not, this thing burned about 1908. You look at it and how would that burn? Enough of it burned that they ended up demolishing it and putting a smaller government building there and moving the post office way out to the edge of town and making the rest of it Government Square. The Ohio Phonograph location, sorry, let me get out of the way of the projection, is in this building in the back. It may even be visible, but it's in this photo, but hard to know where it was. And it's hard to know whether the building that's sitting there now is the same one, because the government has put up a barrier there and a guard to keep you out of that alleyway, where you could actually kind of look around and see how old it is. That brings us to our final Ohio Phonograph Company location. And yes, it is the Jimmy Flint store, the store that's run by the brother of the owner of Hustler. But this is the very building that this location was in. And you will note that it already has a historical marker. Apparently it was a lunch counter during the Civil War in Cincinnati called Food and Drink. Now that's an imaginative title. And maybe Thomas Edison had lunch there, you know. But in any event, that building is the same as this one. And oddly enough, within the same year, Patrick and I discussed that number 183. It is the same building. In a pamphlet that was a catalog that was published this same year, that was a catalog of a listing of kinetoscope subjects. The address is listed as 411 Elm Street. So yeah, they were really messing up the numbers, you know, at that time. But essentially, that brings us to the end of our local phonograph locations. And now I'd like to bring Patrick back to share with you actual recordings made by the Ohio Phonograph Company.
All right, well, we'll see what some of these buildings are today. And so, hey, how do I get to the local phonograph arcade? Well, what day of the week is it? 183, 411? Okay. Switch back here and resume our tale. Okay, so here's where I left off. So, what was so special about the Ohio Phonograph Company? I mean, you had lots of different companies out here. Basically, each one of these had a territory, and that company was in charge of leasing phonographs there, selling phonograph supplies. Those were what it was supposed to do. Everybody who got one of these territories paid a good bit of money for the right to that territory. But that's what most of these places did. They would just do that business and leave it at that. But there were a few companies that went above and beyond the call of duty and really tried to do a bit more for the phonograph industry than the others. One of them, Uncle Dave has mentioned, was the Columbia Phonograph Company, which is likely the only one of these sub-companies you've heard of before tonight. That was District of Columbia, also Maryland and Delaware, so it's that whole territory here that essentially became Columbia Phonograph of later years. But the Ohio Phonograph Company did some special things as well. I mean, here's James Andom, by the way. I like to think that his voice probably sounded a good bit like Uncle Dave's reading of that piece. In fact, I'd like to ask him to voice James Andom for me as I get to direct quotations in my presentation. We're trying to dramatize this as much as we can. Uncle Dave Lewis is James L. Andom. So we'll get to some of those here shortly. But then he got into publishing a bit. There had been a guide book to the Edison phonograph that Edison himself had put out in 1889, but by 1892 that was pretty well out of date. So Andom wrote his own practical guide to the use of the Edison phonograph, published by
Yeah, great.
Okay, so major local publisher, 1892. A couple years later, there had been a trade journal for the phonograph industry for a few years, 1890 through 1893, called the Phonogram, published by a woman named Virginia McLay. But shortly after the World's Columbian Exposition, that stopped publishing. So Andom jumped in with his own Edison Phonographic News. You see one issue of it right there. He said it was, quote, devoted to the dissemination of information relating to the Edison phonograph and kindred inventions. And it had a lot of fairly interesting stories in it. But where did Andom get all his juicy information? Well, years later, he testified in court.
I might confess a trade secret by stating that I joined a news clipping bureau, which furnished me with all items appearing in the newspapers regarding the phonograph, and consequently my editorial ability was simply shown in taking the clippings, commenting upon them, and sending them to the printer.
Still, a lot more than most people who were running phonograph companies locally were doing. So he's going above and beyond the call of duty and handling his local franchise here already. Unfortunately, no complete run of this periodical is going to exist. So if you see it sitting in a local antique store or something like this, by all means grab it up. It's extremely, extremely scarce. There's also his innovations with the coin in the slot machine. Now, nickel in the slot phonographs were fairly common already by 1890 or so. The very first one famously put in San Francisco in November of 1889. But the thing is, most places were installing these singly, have one automatic phonograph in one place, whether it was a bar or a ferry port just along the street someplace. You'd put one of these things, or maybe a couple, but that would be it. And what is this device like? It's a little bit like a jukebox, except it has one recording on it at a time. So it's got one selection. You don't get to choose. Whatever is there is what you hear. You listen through ear tubes. So it doesn't just project sound into the environment. After all, then you'd only have to pay one nickel and a bunch of people would get to hear. This way, one person pays, one person gets to listen. And it was battery powered, so there would have been a battery here in the case. But so this sort of thing you might see elsewhere out on the street, one or two of them at a time. Andom changed this a bit. First of all, he designed or adopted, perfected a specific type of automatic phonograph. It was actually patented here by a local inventor, Marcus O. Anthony of Cincinnati. Do we know anything about him?
No, no.
Electrician, I know, but in any case, he assigned his patent to James L. Andom, so they had their own special Edison slot machine. It was different from the ones being operated anywhere else. But the real difference was in how he deployed them.
Receipts at first were quite large, but the cost of inspection was very heavy. The cylinders were easily damaged and thrown out of adjustment, and people treated the machines in a pretty rough manner at times. We finally grouped them together in what we called a system of arcades. We have a place in Cincinnati called an arcade, and one in Cleveland of the same sort. We found there that by putting the machines in groups of 10, having an attendant present to make changes, and to keep the machines in the best adjustment in which they can be kept, the receipts were larger.
So instead of having a couple phonographs here, one phonograph there, you put them all in one place. And then people who go there, they have their choice of 5 selections. You don't have to send someone all around the city to fix these machines and charge your batteries. They can do it all in one place. It all started here in, well, here in this ad, Cleveland, on September 13th, 1890. Here's the newspaper ad introducing the very first set of, in this case, 5, notice 5 phonographs at this point, but he kept adding to that until he was up to about a dozen. Here's the arcade in Cleveland, the very first one he opened in September. In Cincinnati, though, he opened one in the early part of November of 1890. Here's the very first phonograph.
I love this picture, by the way. This is my favorite picture of the Cincinnati, Ohio phonograph location. Sorry.
So one thing to point out here is, and it's very hard to see in this picture, but there's this framed thing in the front window. That's a list of the selections that were on machines there that day, and they changed the program pretty regularly. So people would walk by, they'd take a look here and see, well, what are on the machines today? What kind of going to listen to? And you'll see there was also one of those in Cincinnati. I'm assuming that that's what this thing here is. So, as was reported in an article from 1891, every morning a new series of cylinders are placed upon the machines, giving an entirely new program, except that certain popular, much called for records are kept constantly on exhibition to answer the recurring demands of the patrons of the parlors. For instance, the Night Alarm, a band record descriptive of a fire, with calls of the firemen, ringing of the bells, the clattering of horses' hooves, and the unwinding of the hose carriage reel, though it has been continuously exhibited since the opening of these parlors, is as popular as ever, and the receipts show that the public are not tired of it. So there were big hits that stayed on the machines from week to week and didn't change, starting with this piece called The Night Alarm. Well, what would we actually have heard if we could have gone into one of these parlors and listened to some of these recordings? Well, let's say, for the purposes of argument, that we have 35 cents in our pocket. 35 cents in nickels or tokens. Here's an Ohio Phonograph Company token that you could get to put in the machines instead if you wanted to. So what can we hear tonight for 35 cents? Well, let's start with The Night Alarm, that piece that we were just hearing about that supposedly stayed on the machines from week to week. Now you notice, though, this is Holdings Military Band of New York City. It's like those salsa ads. New York City! So this is not made in Ohio. It's shipped in from outside. So some material is coming in from other places to be played on phonographs here. But if you were in New York City and you were listening to that on a coin in the slot machine, you'd be done. You'd have to walk a few blocks to listen to another one. And not here in Cincinnati or elsewhere in Ohio. There's going to be another machine right next to it. And what might be on that one? Well, maybe you will have something of local origin. Here's one recording, presumably made for the Ohio Phonograph Company, because they had the rights to record whatever they wanted to in Ohio, nobody else could. Announced a flute solo played by Mr. Arthur Husted of Norwalk, Ohio. Mr. Husted was indeed in Norwalk, Ohio. He's described as, quote, for years a leading flutist with American symphony orchestras, and was later active in the tobacco business. But Norwalk is about 60 miles from Cleveland, so this may have been produced for one of the Cleveland parlors. So maybe this is what would have been on the next phonograph.
A flute solo played by Mr. Arthur Husted of Norwalk, Ohio.
So did we get our nickels worth that time?
Yeah.
Maybe so. Certainly in terms of the length of the cylinder, that's longer than many of them. But Arthur Husted didn't go on to become a major recording artist. And each cylinder that got put on these machines, to a certain degree, was a kind of an experiment. You could see, well, how many nickels did it bring in? It would be announced with a card on top of it as to what it was. So if something didn't bring in a lot of nickels, maybe you wouldn't put on a lot more cylinders like that one. But if you got a lot of nickels for a particular selection, then you'd go out of your way to try to find more things like that. And around 1890, the thing that the Ohio Phonograph Company found was really raking in the nickels was this guy, Dan Kelly, who was a retired Shakespearean actor, who impersonated an Irish-American character named Pat Brady for a series of cylinders. Let's let Mr. Andon explain the situation.
Our largest receipt comes from records that have talk on them, especially humorous talk. I need not specify what kind of humorous talk, perhaps any more definitely, but there are certain cylinders of that kind that are very profitable. We find that class of cylinder brings in more money than music.
Now, these cylinders were exhibited locally, but they were also sent all around the country from Cincinnati. Someone who worked for companies in Texas and Louisiana said he could afford to pay $5 a piece for these records because they brought in so much money. In fact, these were among the first records to be pirated once other people found out ways to duplicate the cylinders. So, for instance, they would connect two machines with a tube, play one, we were recording on another, sell the copies. Or there was another machine that was built to take vibrations from one machine and transfer them to a cutter on another machine without turning it into sound in between. So systems like that. And at this time, there was no intellectual property in sound recordings, nothing like copyright, but these techniques were protected. So that's how things played out. And it was rather upset that people were selling inferior copies of these records and getting away with it. There really wasn't much you could do about it at that point. Maybe his first indication that he might be getting the short end of the stick in his dealings with Thomas Edison. But here's one Pat Brady record, Patty's Wedding.
Patty's Wedding by Dan Kelly, Cincinnati, Ohio. Like the lad, like the lady, oh, like the lad.
gotta hear this one. Oh, go, put a nickel in there. You gotta hear this one. I'm really just hoping that's not what this is about. So these were extremely, extremely popular.
I also the address. I haven't seen that one before. 220 Walnut.
Okay.
Thanks. So I'll have to look that one up. Like that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Another group, well, this is a quartet that the Ohio Phonograph Company recorded a good deal. The original Bison City Quartet. Here's the Mill Medley with Imitations. The imitations are kind of fun.
Sung by the original Bison City Quartet for the Ohio Phonograph Company.
Now here's a recording by a performer we don't really know anything about. In fact, it's just a guess that H.G. Williams is the name being announced here. However, we do have a pretty good sense for how the record's likely to have been made. This picture down in the corner there is not a picture of H.G. Williams or anything from Ohio, but the sort of situation you had to devise to make a recording. You had to place things in unusual situations to make a good record. So you see here, a piano has been raised up on a platform. The performer is behind it here, so that you have several horns at once, and they're all directed at the performer's head, and then with the piano right behind it. So a lot of trickery like this went into making records back then. So I think it's also worth noting that the person who was making all these records was not James Andon. He was the president of the company. It was actually a guy by the name of George H. Dunham, who was the technical expert, who would have been behind the scenes making sure these records came out okay.
We play as sung by H.G. Williams, record taken from the Ohio Phonograph Company, Cincinnati. I was searching my heart until I wouldn't have loved me. sweet melody. And I sit down to rest down with thee. Every star that does the sky seems to stand and wonder why they're together than your eyes. Sweet melody. Come to me, sweet melody, sweet melody. Come to me, not because your face is sad, just to see. From your soul so pure and sweet, makes me wonder at your feet, makes me wonder at your feet, sweet melody.
Speed fluctuations, their battery was probably having problems in part of their recording. So this is what you would have to do just to record a single performer with a piano. What do you suppose you had to do when you were recording a whole quartet? Well, they all had to bunch themselves together around a horn, and they used to complain that they had to bump their heads together while they were singing in order to make a decent record. One more by the original Bison City Quartet.
Rock is the great melody sung by the original Bison City Quartet of the Ohio Phonograph Company, Cincinnati, Ohio.
They said that when you had nickel in the slot machines in bars and saloons and places like that, it was the hymns that actually did best in situations like that, curiously. I just want to mention, there probably, can you imagine there be any other city other than maybe New York and London where you could listen to this much locally recorded material from the early 1890s? This is really unusual.
Yeah.
That the city would be this well documented in its period. I think Cincinnati is pretty close to unique.
I'd say so, I'd agree.
Got one nickel left. Let's go out on a high note. Now, we've been talking about the challenges of making a record, but making a record of a brass band was about the hardest thing of all to do, because you'd have to arrange all the instruments in very peculiar, unconventional ways in order to balance their sounds properly for an acoustically made record. No electricity used in the recording process other than just to turn the cylinder. This is all based on sheer energy from sound waves. This is actually a picture of a different band making records somewhere else, but it gives you an idea for what's involved here. This Brand's Band of Cincinnati was one enterprise that was actually brought in Calvin G. Child, who was one of the expert record makers who had worked for the New England Phonograph Company and Columbia Phonograph Company. He worked with Brand's band to get them into practice for making records like this, and then he went to go work for Berliner's Gramophone. So he was only in Ohio for a very short period of time, but he made some very, very good records. And Brand's band and Michael Brand are, I understand, pretty important too. What do you know about him?
Brand led two groups. One was called the Cincinnati Orchestra, which was a group independent of the Cincinnati Symphony, and he was one of the founders of the Cincinnati Symphony, although he was best known for his concert band, which was called Brand's Concert Band.
Good evening. May I have your attention, please?
Hold on.
In 30 minutes, the main library will be closing for the night. If you are working on a computer, please be sure to save your work before shutting it down and pick up any items you may have at the printer. Also be sure to take any items you wish to borrow to a self-checkout station or the checkout desk on the first floor. Once again, the main library will be closing in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Brand also, his main gig was leading the concert band at the Cincinnati Zoo during the summer. He died in August 1904.
So here is Brand's concert band.
Selection from the Chimes of Normandy, played by Brand's concert band.
We've used up our 35 cents, but if we had another nickel, I really couldn't help you because you've now heard as much of the recordings of the Ohio Phonograph Company as I have. They're very scarce and very hard to come by. There are performers that we know recorded for the Ohio Company. Marguerite Newton was a fairly important early recording artist. Also, her husband, George P. Watson, a yodeler, both recorded for Ohio. Also, I'm told by Kurt Knock, who is a premier auctioneer of early sound recordings, that he once had an Ohio Phonograph Company recording of something either sounding like or purporting to be Chinese music or something like that. He wasn't quite sure what this was. I've occasionally been around when he and Michael Kenchilian, who repairs broken cylinder records, when they're together, sometimes they'll start imitating this record. Unfortunately, I think Kurt sold it and doesn't have it anymore. Really be curious to hear that. But I do know that in 1891, there was a concert based on playing phonograph records into a telephone in Indiana. And it was supposedly, one of these cylinders was announced, cornet solo, the rat charmer of Hamelin, as played by Fred Russell, the Chinese impersonator in the laboratory of Love and Company, Cincinnati, Ohio. Love to hear that cylinder. Unfortunately, that's not one of the ones we have. So, Mr. Andom, how did the proceeds come in from the first year of operations with that arcade of yours in Cincinnati?
We had a parlor in the Emery Arcade in Cincinnati, Ohio, opened, I think, in November 1890, where we placed 12 automatic phonographs, and the first year's receipts from that parlor and from those 12 automatic phonographs amounted to within about $200 of $10,000.
So, over the first year, made about $40,000 in profit. This is $40,1890. So they were making some pretty good money at this. More so, by the way, than from doing things like renting the phonograph as a business dictation machine. Things began to drop off with the phonographs, but there were other possibilities as well. In 1894, Andom started adding a kinetoscope to his parlors, so that he's one of the first people to get on board with motion pictures. This is the introduction of that in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Here is the parlor here that Uncle Dave showed you this picture earlier, but there it is again. We've got two windows. One says the Edison phonograph, one says the Edison kinetoscope.
I'm sorry, I forgot also to mention the light bulbs around the windows did flash in a circular pattern to underscore the idea that it was an electric parlor.
This would have been a fun place to see. But in the meantime, there were changes afoot in the bigger industry. Now, the North American company had kept these two competing technologies at bay for a while, but the graphophone people, remember Alexander Graham Bell's team, had pulled out of their agreement at this point. Nobody wanted to buy graphophones anymore, so that wasn't the deal here. The problem was they had a patent in the idea of cutting a record in wax. And so now they started suing anybody who was selling or dealing in Edison phonographs, including the Ohio Phonograph Company. They got slapped with a nice lawsuit about 1893. So that was going on. Meanwhile, there was a slight change in the organization here, where companies basically turned the rights back to North American to handle business in their territories, and they just get a percentage of the proceeds, because this model where local companies had the right to lease machines and sell supplies and so forth really got to be very problematic. If someone, say, wanted to take a phonograph from one state into another, it got to be really complicated. So the running of the business overall was changing around Andom rather rapidly. It's starting to favor a very hands-off approach that was very different from the sort of approach he was taking.
Good evening. May I have your attention, please? In 20 minutes, the main library will be closing for the night. If you are working on a computer, please be sure to save your work before shutting it down and pick up any items you may have at the printer. Also be sure to take any items you wish to borrow to a self-checkout station or the checkout desk on the first floor. Once again, the main library will be closing in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Fall of 1894, North American goes bankrupt and gets placed into the hands of a receiver, John Hardin. Now, up until this point, North American has been honoring its agreements with all these local sub-companies. If you have a territory, you have the right to sell phonographs and phonograph supplies in that territory. Hardin ignores that, starts selling phonographs to anybody he wants to. And so in this period, the local companies that have been established up to this point start finding other ways to stay afloat. Some of them turn into national businesses. So, for example, you had the old New Jersey Phonograph Company that had, similarly to Ohio, started making and selling their own records. They become the United States Phonograph Company, which their records all over the country. Columbia has now allied with the old Graphophone group, so they have a really big position now. In fact, they're the ones who are suing other companies to try to shut them down at this point. Andom does something similar, and yet different. Edison, by the way, ends up buying the assets of the company and transmogrifies that into his own new company, the National Phonograph Company, maker of Edison records and so forth. So He ends up buying the old North American company that had had all these local agreements. That's 1896. In the meantime, Andon starts setting up branches outside Ohio. So on the one hand, this looks a little bit like these other cases where someone is branching out and trying to start a national business, but his is a little bit different. He sets up a branch in Indiana. Well, Indiana had never been assigned to a sub-company, so that was open territory. He started a branch in Chicago. Well, Lake County, Illinois had never been assigned to a company. So he's finding all the places where there was no local sub-company ever, and he started to do business there. However, he finds that even so, trying to still sort of play by the rules, honor the old system of territories, he can't stay afloat. And so in 1897, he throws the Ohio Phonograph Company into receivership, and then has the guy who's running his Indianapolis branch buy it for cheap, and then keeps managing it. But now he's calling it the Edison Phonograph Company, with offices in Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago, and Indianapolis. He later got asked about this name in court. Why did you call this the Edison Phonograph Company?
Because it dealt in Edison phonographs.
Well, why didn't you conduct the business in your own name, as it's usually done by tradesmen, after you had bought up the assets of the Ohio Phonograph Company?
Because the name Edison Phonograph Company conveyed to the public a better idea of the business than the name of an individual would.
Angham's new company continued to make and sell records, including those by brands banned, and also kept open the company's phonograph parlors, although they've become relatively less profitable. Mr. Andam, why did this business fall off, do you imagine?
The public began purchasing machines of their own. The novelty had begun to wear off, and other attractions like the kinetoscope, motion picture machines, and etc., aided in reducing the receipts of the nickel and the slot phonographs.
And finally, these parlors, which at first had been very profitable, were closed up, as I understand it.
No, the parlors were maintained by the Ohio Phonograph Company until 1900. And were not then closed up by the Ohio Phonograph Company, but were closed up by the Edison people, who got out an attachment against the company.
So Andam continued business in general up until June of 1900, at which point he was blacklisted by Edison's new company. Tell us about it.
Let's see, I should,
why had you been blacklisted? It was
okay,
because...
why?
Skipping ahead through some questions.
Owing to the competition that I had referred to, and the fact that the National Phonograph Company was giving larger discounts to some of the people in Ohio than I was able to give them. I got behind, and finally was unable to meet some of the obligations that I had incurred to the National Phonograph Company for the purchase of machines, and the National Phonograph Company brought suit in the Justice Court by dividing up a large bill in 3 suits, and in that way closed me out, closed my store on Ray Street out. I was compelled to make an assignment.
So, Andam's been crowded out by Edison. He started out as the operator of a local sub-company, had paid $80,000 for that right, and now it's worthless. Not only that, he's not even getting the same terms as other Edison dealers. He can't get anything to sell. He's pretty unhappy. So he starts to consider and pursue legal action against Edison for violation of contract. Now he starts off doing this out of Ohio, but then he realizes, wait a second here, every single sub-company in the whole country would have the same grievance against Thomas Edison. He's not respecting any of the contracts from back in the 1880s. Those should still be enforced theoretically. So he went around and started making a deal with every local sub-company he could get in touch with, that he would pursue their legal case against Edison. He would foot the bill for all the legal fees in return for 60% of whatever they could get out of Thomas Alva Edison. So he moved the main battlefield from Ohio to New York, the New York Phonograph Company, because that was nearer New Jersey. It's a lot easier to sue someone in New Jersey from New York. And then if New York went favorably to him, then that would set a precedent for all the other cases. But there was another battlefield. One place where he got a foothold was the New England Phonograph Company. But there, Edison started going around behind his back and trying to buy up the stock of the New England Phonograph Company, and succeeded to a point in doing this. So they basically called off the agreement, said, okay, you can't represent us in court anymore. In 1904, there was a really tendentious stockholders meeting where you had two factions, Edison's group, Andon's group. And there was a dispute over the vote over the new board of directors. Should it be decided by the greatest number of shares or the greatest number of voters? So we basically ended up having both sides believing they had a different board of directors. Andon's team demanded the seal and books of the company from Edison's team. They refused to give it to him. Well, fair enough. They filed a new lawsuit anyway, put a seal on it. Andon signed his name as secretary. And then in 1907, he was arraigned for forgery for making this document when he wasn't supposedly, according to Edison people, really the secretary of the New England Phonograph Company. One newspaper, the Mail and Express, published the headline, "Tried to extort money of Edison." So Andon sued the newspaper for defamation of character and won. The jury gave him an award of 6 cents in damages. But the other battlefield, New York, ended up going Edison's way. According to Paul Israel's biography of Edison, quote, "The courts ruled that Edison, as the purchaser of the bankrupt North American, had to uphold New York Phonograph Company's contracts. The company, as a consequence, National Phonograph, could not sell phonographs and records in New York State that were covered by several of Edison's patents." In 1909, the New York Times reported, "Thomas A. Edison has settled for $450,000, a suit for breach of contract brought against him by the New York Phonograph Company." Remember, Andon gets 60%. In addition, his counsel have signed agreements to settle approximately 700 suits brought by the New York Company against dealers in this state. The amount involved in the settlement of these and the principal suit is approximately $2 million. At that point, the New England Phonograph Company case was still pending. Plus, Andon began pushing additional cases with New York and New England. There were 9 in all: Wisconsin Phonograph, Kansas Phonograph, State Phonograph of Illinois, Kentucky Phonograph Company, Missouri, Minnesota, Edison of Ohio. So many that at one point he couldn't even remember them all off the top of his head to list them when he was asked to name all the companies in court. I'm not sure how all these various cases ended up going, but you can see on a map how wide a swath of the country he's now controlled in terms of those whole state sub-companies. Now, but if only a fraction of these went his way, he would have wound up a pretty wealthy man. According to his obituary, Mr. Andon retired in 1908. He lived thereafter in Bloomfield and Montclair, New Jersey, but since 1915 had made his home in New York. His wife, the former Grace Lombard, died in 1912. He died March 29, 1932, at the age of 90. A private funeral service will be held in Rosedale Cemetery, Montclair, and many years later, in the year 2014, his memory will be honored by a meeting at a library in Cincinnati. Uncle Dave, any last comments to sum up? I think
Well, we're
finished my
running out of
narrative.
time. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I just wanted to say, does this mean that Cincinnati is the birthplace of the record business? We don't know. That map of companies, that's a lot of companies. What we can say is that Andon managed to get his company started even before the end of 1888. And remember that North American was only put together like in the spring of that year. So he came fast. And I'm really pulling for him. Certainly Columbia might be a problem.
Yeah,
but
Columbia, they were latecomers.
Yeah, they were latecomers, and like Sony is claiming that they got started in 1886. No way. You know, that in this new book they published, this coffee table book they published last year, they claim 1886. No way, 1886. Edward Easton didn't even see a phonograph before 1887. It's a good chance that Cincinnati really is the birthplace of commercial recording. That was what made me want to ask Patrick in the first place when I stumbled on him 15 or so years ago. So we don't know, but prospects are good, and we'll keep working. Thank you for coming. Any questions? We don't have a lot of time, but it's time for at least one. I know you're tired. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or an observation. You mentioned that early light-based recording system, which looked to me just like optical film sound, which was used for years and years. Is there a direct correlation between those methods?
It is the same technique, and there is enough of a continuity there. I believe that system was worked out separately, but then there was a patent dispute where they ended up pulling out these old glass discs and saying, hey, see, someone was doing this back in the 1880s. You can't patent that method of recording the sound on film. So at least as far as that goes, there was enough of a connection to come up in court.
And the other thing, I can't remember now what exact recording it was, but you made me think of it when you were talking about how to make several recordings at once, having several machines. I saw on the web that somebody had found 2 of these recordings, and maybe you know which recordings I'm thinking of. It's an old jazz recording or something, where they had determined that these 2 machines were in different parts of the same room, and so it turned out to be the first stereo recording.
Yeah, the Ellington stereo. Those were made by RCA Victor. Yeah, but it was accidental stereo, they call it.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 different mic setups that go feeding 2 different masters, and the concept was that if you could get the disc masters to sync up, that you would get the stereo. And I think that the effect is pretty convincing.
Yeah.
You know, it's a little out of phase. Yeah.
How long did the cylinder stay around? When did that fade out?
1929.
At least for the commercial things.
Yeah.
There were no commercial releases after that point. People still use them for home recording and things like that.
Yeah, and in fact, have you ever heard the phone calls of President Kennedy, like saying to Governor Wallace, well, you got to accept this black student, you got to accept him today, and that's actually from a wax cylinder, because President Kennedy used a cylinder to monitor his phone conversations, but later he went to dictabelts, which was a similar technology. It was a celluloid sleeve that fit around a couple of pinch rollers. Yeah.
Okay, those cylinders, they belong to an archive that you recorded that you're
Well, some of them belong to the University of California at Santa Barbara. A number of them are in the private collection, actually. And in fact, probably a majority of Ohio Phonograph Company cylinders today are in private hands.
So they allowed you to...
Well, these, I mean, we've got transfers from various sources over the years.
One of them was on a site called, isn't that Discmute, or the one of the Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep? That's from a public.
Tinfoil.com.
Yeah, tinfoil.com, which is run by a person, collector. Glenn Sage.
In the very early days of cylinder recordings, if the musicians or singer wasn't happy with the recording, or if they made a mistake, would they throw that out and record again, or how would they do the retakes?
Well, you couldn't fix anything, but you could sheathe the cylinder and reuse it. So you didn't have to throw the whole wax piece out. You could just shave a little bit off and use it as a new blank. However, quality control was rather low in this period, so you'll find that many flubs made it through.
What was that .com address again?
Tinfoil.com.
Tinfoil?
Where Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep.
I have a friend at home that likes these, like a phonograph buff.
There's a lot there to listen to.
Okay.
Well,
also the collection of cylinders at the University of California, Santa Barbara. They have a huge cylinder website as well.
We had a wonderful time. I hate to get the old crook and pull Patrick and I out of here, but the library's open for about 3 more minutes. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Do you belong to an organization?
I do of a few different organizations. One is the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, ARSC, which is certainly it's pretty well known, but it's